A ruthless biker gang terrorizing the town thought they found their next victim, a quiet black man walking alone. But they had no idea who they were messing with. What happens next will leave you stunned. Watch to the end and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. James Wilson, a 35-year-old former heavyweight boxing champion, stood at the edge of his new driveway in the quiet town of Madison, taking in the peaceful surroundings. It had been years since he stepped into the ring, and though his glory days were far behind him, he felt ready to start a fresh chapter. Retirement from boxing had been bittersweet. His once chiseled physique had softened, and the discipline of a rigid training schedule was now a distant memory. He carried extra weight now, enough that even simple tasks felt harder than before, but his confidence remained unshaken. The small-town life promised simplicity and a chance to rebuild, away from the spotlight. Within days of his arrival, friendly neighbors approached him with cautious smiles, welcoming him, but not without a word of warning. The stories were all the same. A gang of bikers called the Burning Skulls dominated the town. They were notorious for terrorizing locals, targeting those who didn't fit their mold of what Madison should look like. This included minorities, outsiders, and anyone who dared to challenge their authority. The leader of the gang, a man named Roy, was said to be as cruel as he was intimidating. The town seemed gripped by fear, and the residents had grown accustomed to living under the bikers' oppressive shadow. James listened to these warnings with calm interest, but without fear. He had faced giants in the ring, endured grueling battles, and emerged victorious. A group of loudmouthed bikers didn't faze him. "I appreciate the heads up," he told one elderly neighbor with a reassuring smile, "but I've handled worse." As the days passed, James settled into his new routine. He enjoyed the quietness of his surroundings and the anonymity the town offered. Yet, it was hard to ignore the nervous glances people cast over their shoulders or the way conversations abruptly stopped when the distant roar of motorcycle engines echoed through the streets. The bikers' presence was a cloud hanging over the town, their dominance obvious in the way people avoided certain streets or spoke in hushed tones. Late one evening, James decided to take a walk through the main street. The cool breeze and the dim glow of streetlights gave the small town a sense of serenity he hadn't felt in years. But as he turned a corner, the low rumble of engines broke the silence. A group of bikers rolled in, their motorcycles growling like predators stalking their prey. They came to a stop in the middle of the street, their leather jackets bearing the flaming skull emblem that James had heard so much about. The bikers' eyes locked onto him. Their leader, a burly man with a long beard and a cruel smirk, stepped off his bike. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Roy said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A new face in our little town." James didn't flinch under their scrutiny. He met Roy's gaze calmly, his posture relaxed but alert. "Just taking a walk," he replied evenly. Roy chuckled, but the sound carried no warmth. "You must be new if you're walking around like you own the place. Didn't anyone tell you the rules?" James raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" "Yeah," Roy sneered, stepping closer. "The kind that say people like you don't belong here." The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing off the empty buildings. They hurled insults, mocking James's weight, his appearance, and his skin color. "Look at this guy," one of them jeered. "What are you supposed to be? A retired sumo wrestler?" James stood his ground, his expression unchanged. He had heard worse on the streets and in the ring. Words didn't hurt him, but the malice behind them made his muscles tighten instinctively. Roy stepped even closer, invading his personal space. "You'd better watch yourself, big guy," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We don't take kindly to people who think they can walk around here like they own the place." James didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Roy, his eyes steady and unreadable. Finally, he said, "I'm not looking for trouble, just living my life." Roy's smirk faded, replaced by a glint of anger. "Living your life?" he repeated mockingly. "Not in my town, you're not." With that, Roy shoved James's shoulder, a deliberate provocation. James didn't react the way Roy had expected. Instead of stumbling back or retaliating, James held his ground, his sheer presence more intimidating than any words he could have said. "That's enough," James said, his tone firm but calm. "You don't want to do this." Roy hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet authority in James's voice. The moment stretched uncomfortably, but then Roy laughed again, though it sounded forced this time. "We'll see about that," he said, stepping back. He signaled to his gang and they mounted their bikes. The engines roared to life and the group sped off, their laughter fading into the night. James watched them go, his fists unclenching slowly. He had faced their type before, bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation, but he also knew that this was only the beginning. As he turned and walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation had set something in motion. The sun was setting over Madison as James Wilson walked through the quiet streets, his mind occupied by the events of the previous evening. The confrontation with the bikers had been brief, but it lingered in his thoughts. He had seen the malice in their eyes and heard the venom in their words. For a moment, he wondered if moving to Madison had been a mistake. He wasn't afraid of the bikers, but he had come here for peace, not conflict. Yet, avoiding them entirely didn't seem like an option. He resolved to carry on with his life as planned and not let a gang of thugs dictate his actions. Later that evening, James decided to take a stroll through a different part of town, hoping for a quieter experience. The air was crisp, and the faint hum of crickets provided a soothing background. However, his sense of calm didn't last long. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance. The sound grew louder, and James turned to see the same group of bikers approaching, their headlights piercing through the dim light of the street lamps. The gang slowed down as they neared him, and once again, their leader, Roy, was at the forefront. The smirk on his face was as condescending as ever. "Well, look who it is," Roy called out, his voice booming over the growl of the engines. "Our new friend, out for another walk. Guess you didn't get the message last night." James stopped in his tracks, his expression calm but watchful. The bikers circled around him, their motorcycles forming a loud, menacing barrier. The laughter and taunts began almost immediately. "Look at this guy," one of them sneered, "still waddling around like he owns the place. Bet he's out here practicing for the next hot dog eating contest," another chimed in, eliciting a chorus of laughter from the group. James stood silently, his gaze steady as he assessed the situation. Their words didn't sting. He had faced harsher criticism during his career. What concerned him was their increasing aggression. It was clear that they were trying to provoke a reaction. Roy dismounted his bike and approached James, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement. "You don't seem to learn, do you?" he said, stopping just inches away. "This is our town. People like you need to understand their place." James met Roy's gaze without flinching. "I told you before, I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice even and composed, "but I'm not going anywhere." Roy's smirk twisted into a sneer. "You're not looking for trouble? Well, trouble's looking for you." Without warning, Roy shoved James again, harder this time. James staggered back a step but quickly regained his balance. The other bikers cheered, their voices filled with mockery and glee. James took a deep breath, his fists clenching briefly before relaxing. He knew how to handle aggression, but he also knew that giving in to anger wouldn't solve anything. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Walk away while you still can." Roy laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that grated against James's ears. "Or what? You gonna sit on me? Let me tell you something, fat man. You're in no shape to do anything." The gang erupted in laughter again, their taunts growing louder and more vulgar. As much as James wanted to put Roy in his place, he held back. He wasn't here to fight, especially not in the middle of the street with no witnesses other than the gang. He knew that violence would only escalate the situation. "This is your last warning," James said, his voice low but full of authority. "Leave me alone." Roy took another step forward, his fists clenching as if ready to throw a punch. But before he could make a move, a shout came from the end of the street. "Hey, what's going on here?" A man in a police uniform was jogging toward them, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering. Roy scowled and backed away, muttering curses under his breath. "We're not done here," he growled at James before turning to his gang. "Let's go." The engines roared to life, and the bikers sped off into the night, their taunts still echoing faintly as they disappeared down the street. James watched them go, his jaw tightening as he let out a slow breath. He turned to the officer, who approached with a concerned expression. "You okay?" the officer asked. "I'm fine," James replied. "They're just trying to intimidate me." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "They've been causing trouble around here for years. If you ever feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call us." James thanked the officer and continued on his way, his mind racing. The bikers weren't going to stop. They thrived on fear, and James knew they would keep pushing until they got the reaction they wanted. He had hoped to avoid conflict, but it was becoming clear that a confrontation was inevitable. As he reached his house and stepped inside, he felt a growing resolve. He wasn't going to let them control his life or this town. One way or another, he would put an end to their reign of terror. James sat at his kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet room as he stared at his reflection in the window. The events of the past few days played over and over in his mind, each encounter with the bikers more intense than the last. He had come to Madison to escape, to rebuild, but it seemed trouble had found him regardless. The weight of his frustration pressed on him, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the fire that had driven him during his boxing career. He pushed back from the table and walked to the living room, where a dusty set of boxing gloves sat on the shelf. He picked them up, the familiar leather smell stirring memories of his time in the ring. In those days, his body had been a machine, honed to perfection through years of grueling training. Now he was heavier, slower, and out of practice. The thought of how far he had fallen physically gnawed at him, but he also knew that the core of who he was hadn't changed. He was still a fighter, and the skills that had carried him to victory were still in his blood. That night, James made a decision. He moved the old coffee table aside and cleared a space in his living room. Without a gym or proper equipment, he resorted to what he had: himself. He started with stretches, feeling the tightness in his muscles as he tried to regain some of the flexibility he had lost. Push-ups, sit-ups, and shadow boxing followed, each motion pulling him back into a rhythm he thought he had forgotten. Sweat dripped down his face as his breath came in sharp bursts, but he pushed through the fatigue. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This was about standing up to those who thrived on fear and intimidation. The next morning, sore but determined, James walked to the local diner for breakfast. As he entered, a hush fell over the room. People glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with worry. He could tell that word of his encounters with the bikers had spread. Sitting at the counter, James nodded politely to the waitress, who gave him a nervous smile. "You're the new guy, right?" she asked softly. "That's me," James replied, keeping his tone light. "I heard about what happened with Roy and his gang," she said, leaning closer. "You should be careful. They don't take kindly to being challenged." "I've noticed," James said with a small smile, "but I'm not planning on backing down." The waitress looked impressed but concerned. "Most folks around here just keep their heads down and try to stay out of their way. You're not like most folks, are you?" "No, ma'am," James said, his voice steady. "I've been through worse than a gang of bikers." As he finished his meal and left the diner, James felt the eyes of the patrons on him. He knew the townspeople were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. It wasn't fear that drove him, but a sense of responsibility. If he didn't stand up to the bikers, who would? That evening, James went for another walk, this time near the edge of town. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car. As he rounded a corner, the distant sound of engines made him pause. It was faint at first, but grew louder with every passing second. The bikers appeared again, their formation tighter and their demeanor more aggressive. Roy led the pack, his expression dark and focused. The group stopped a few feet away, the engines of their motorcycles growling like caged animals. "Back for more, huh?" Roy called out, dismounting his bike. The others followed suit, forming a semicircle around James. James didn't flinch. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. "You're really persistent," he said, his voice firm but even. Roy stepped forward, his fists clenched. "I told you this is our town, and you're making a big mistake thinking you can walk around like you own the place." James tilted his head slightly. "I don't need to own anything. I just don't take orders from bullies." The tension crackled in the air as the bikers closed in. One of them, a wiry man with a sneer, lunged first, trying to catch James off guard. But James sidestepped with a speed that belied his size, delivering a quick jab that sent the man sprawling. The other bikers hesitated for a moment, shocked by how quickly their comrade had fallen. Roy growled in frustration and signaled for the others to attack. They rushed at James, but he was ready. His movements were deliberate, his punches precise. Despite his heavier frame, he moved with the grace of a trained fighter, his years of experience shining through. One by one, the bikers fell, each attempt to overpower him met with a counterattack that left them on the ground. The fight didn't last long. When it was over, Roy stood alone, breathing heavily as he stared at his fallen gang. James took a step toward him, his gaze unwavering. "This is your last chance," he said. "Leave me alone or you'll regret it." Roy hesitated, his confidence shaken. He looked around at his defeated gang, then back at James. "You think this is over?" he spat before turning and mounting his bike. The others followed, limping and groaning as they climbed back onto their motorcycles. The roar of their engines filled the air as they sped off into the night. James stood in the street, his breathing heavy but controlled. His muscles ached, but the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. He knew this wasn't the end, but it was a step in the right direction. As he walked back to his house, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the town, for the people who had been living in fear for far too long. James woke the next morning with his body aching from the previous night's fight. His muscles protested every movement, but the soreness was a reminder of his renewed purpose. He had taken a stand, and the bikers had learned that he wasn't someone they could easily intimidate. Still, he knew the confrontation wasn't over. Roy and his gang wouldn't let the humiliation go unanswered. They thrived on fear, and James had publicly undermined their power. It was only a matter of time before they came back for revenge. Determined to stay ahead, James spent the day preparing himself. He focused on his training, repeating the exercises he had begun in his living room and pushing himself harder. Each punch he threw into the air felt sharper, more precise. He hadn't regained his peak form, but the fire in his chest grew with every jab and hook. His body remembered the rhythm, the discipline, and the strategy that had once made him a champion. By evening, sweat poured down his face and his breath came in short bursts, but he felt more ready than he had in years. As the sun set, James went out for his usual evening walk, this time choosing a well-lit and busier street. He knew the bikers wouldn't risk attacking him in front of too many witnesses, but he also wanted to show the town he wasn't hiding. His presence on the streets was a silent statement that fear wouldn't control him. Passers-by glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and respect, some even nodding in silent support. Word of his fight with the bikers had spread, and James could feel the shift in the atmosphere. People were still wary, but there was a spark of hope in their eyes. The sound of roaring engines broke the quiet buzz of the street, and James's chest tightened as he turned toward the source. Sure enough, the bikers appeared again, their headlights cutting through the night like searchlights. There were more of them this time, their ranks bolstered by new faces, but James recognized Roy at the front, his expression colder than ever. The gang stopped in the middle of the street, blocking traffic and drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Roy dismounted his bike first, followed by the others. This time, they weren't laughing or throwing insults. Their demeanor was different, angrier, more focused. Roy stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You made a fool out of us," he said, his voice low but laced with venom. "Nobody does that," and walks away. James held his ground, his posture calm but alert. "You brought it on yourselves," he replied evenly. "I told you to leave me alone." The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalks watched in tense silence. Some pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation. James glanced around, noting the growing number of spectators. He hoped their presence would deter the bikers from escalating things further, but the fury in Roy's eyes told him otherwise. "This time, there's no walking away," Roy growled, signaling to his men. They spread out, forming a loose circle around James. The crowd murmured in concern, but no one stepped forward to intervene. James raised his voice, addressing the bikers and the onlookers alike. "You don't have to do this," he said. "It doesn't have to end this way." Roy sneered. "Oh, it's ending all right, but not the way you think." The first biker lunged at James, swinging wildly, but James was ready. He ducked under the blow and countered with a sharp uppercut that sent the man sprawling. The crowd gasped, their phones capturing every moment. Another biker charged in, and James sidestepped, delivering a precise hook that knocked the man off balance. The rhythm of the fight came back to him effortlessly, each movement calculated and deliberate. The bikers tried to overwhelm him with numbers, attacking from all sides, but James's experience shone through. He stayed light on his feet, moving faster than anyone would have expected from a man his size. Punches and kicks landed with precision, and one by one, his attackers fell. The crowd's fear turned to awe as they watched James dismantle the gang with a skill and power that seemed almost unreal. Roy hung back, his face a mask of anger and disbelief as his men were taken down. When the last of them hit the ground, groaning in pain, Roy stepped forward, his fists raised. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat. "You're just a washed-up has-been." James squared his shoulders, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Try me," he said simply. Roy charged, swinging with all his strength, but James dodged effortlessly. He countered with a body shot that left Roy gasping for air, followed by a clean right hook that sent him crashing to the pavement. The crowd erupted into cheers, their phones capturing the moment Roy hit the ground. James stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides as he surveyed the scene. The bikers were either unconscious or too injured to stand, and Roy lay sprawled on the pavement, his confidence shattered. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. James turned toward the crowd, catching the eyes of the spectators who had watched everything unfold. For the first time, he saw genuine gratitude and admiration in their faces. When the police arrived, they quickly assessed the situation, taking statements from witnesses and detaining the bikers. Several members of the crowd eagerly showed the officers the videos they had recorded, providing indisputable evidence of the gang's aggression. The officers thanked James for his courage, but he waved them off humbly. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said. As the bikers were loaded into police cars, James felt a sense of relief, but also resolve. The fight wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for the town and showing the people of Madison that they didn't have to live in fear. The bikers' reign of terror was over, and James had taken the first step toward reclaiming the streets for the community. As he walked home that night, the cheers of the crowd still echoed in his ears, a reminder that one person's courage could inspire change. The aftermath of the confrontation spread through Madison like wildfire. By morning, videos of James defeating the bikers had gone viral, shared not just in the town but across social media platforms. Titles like "The Biker Brawl in Madison" and "Retired Boxer Stands Up to Bullies" flooded the internet. James's name was on everyone's lips, and his face was suddenly recognizable far beyond the small town. Calls from reporters started pouring in, and local news stations began running the story on repeat. While James appreciated the support, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. He had fought to protect himself and the community, not to become a celebrity. The townspeople, however, saw him as a hero. As James walked to the diner that morning, heads turned and people whispered in admiration. Some approached him to shake his hand or thank him for what he had done. Others simply nodded, their expressions a mix of gratitude and newfound respect. James felt the weight of their gratitude and knew it came with an unspoken responsibility to ensure that the bikers wouldn't terrorize the town again. At the diner, the waitress greeted him with a wide smile. "You're all over the news, you know," she said as she poured him a cup of coffee. "The whole town is talking about you." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do it for the attention." "Well, you've got it now," she replied. "And honestly, we needed someone like you. Those bikers have been running this town for too long." As he ate his breakfast, James noticed a group of officers from the Madison Police Department entering the diner. They walked over to him, their expressions serious but respectful. The lead officer, A stocky man named Captain Harris extended a hand. "James Wilson," he said. "I'm Captain Harris. I just wanted to thank you for what you did last night. You've given us the break we needed." James shook his hand firmly. "Just defending myself. They gave me no choice." Harris nodded. "We've been after Roy and his gang for years, but the locals were too scared to testify or provide evidence. Thanks to you, we've got enough footage and witness accounts to press charges. Most of them are being held without bail." "That's good to hear," James said. "This town deserves peace." Harris hesitated before speaking again. "I know you didn't ask for this attention, but you've become something of a symbol here. People feel safer because of what you did. I hope you'll stick around." James smiled faintly. "I didn't come here looking for trouble, but I'm not going anywhere. Madison's my home now." The officers left, and James finished his meal in relative peace. Yet, as he walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The bikers may have been arrested, but Roy wasn't the type to let things go. James knew that people like him held grudges, and he prepared himself for the possibility of retaliation. Later that evening, James heard a knock at his door. Opening it, he found a small group of townspeople standing on his porch, their faces a mixture of nervousness and gratitude. One of them, an elderly man named Mr. Tanner, stepped forward. "We just wanted to thank you," Tanner said, his voice trembling slightly, "for standing up to those bikers. Most of us were too scared to do anything." "You don't have to thank me," James replied. "I just did what anyone should do." "But that's the thing," Tanner said. "Most of us couldn't. We've been living in fear for years. You showed us that we don't have to be afraid anymore." The group nodded in agreement, their gratitude palpable. James felt a swell of emotion as he realized the impact of his actions. He wasn't just defending himself. He had inspired the community to reclaim their town. Over the next few days, James continued his routine. But with each passing hour, the weight of his newfound role settled on him. The calls from reporters didn't stop, and he received invitations to appear on talk shows and news segments. James declined them all, focusing instead on rebuilding his life and supporting the town. He visited local schools and community centers, speaking to children and teenagers about courage, perseverance, and standing up for what's right. His words resonated deeply, and more people began to see him as a leader, not just a fighter. Despite the positivity, James remained vigilant. He knew that Roy and his gang were still a threat, even from behind bars. The thought of them returning lingered at the back of his mind, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into training and reconnecting with the discipline he had once lived by. Each day, he pushed himself further, not just to regain his physical strength, but to prepare for whatever came next. One evening, as James walked through the now quieter streets of Madison, a young boy approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Wilson," the boy asked, clutching a basketball to his chest, "can I ask you something?" James knelt to the boy's level, smiling warmly. "Sure, kid. What's on your mind?" The boy hesitated, then said, "How did you learn to be so brave?" James paused, considering his answer. "It's not about not being scared," he said finally. "It's about not letting fear stop you from doing what's right." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. As he ran off, James stood and looked around at the town he now called home. The streets felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of years of fear had begun to lift. For the first time, James felt that he truly belonged, not just as a resident, but as someone who had made a difference. and though he knew challenges still lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, journalists, and witnesses as the trial of Roy and his gang began. For years, the burning skulls had ruled over Madison with fear, but now the tables had turned. The video evidence, along with testimonies from James and other residents, painted a damning picture of their crimes. The gang members sat in silence, their usual bravado replaced with sullen expressions as the judge read the charges against them. Roy, in particular, looked defeated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. James sat among the witnesses, watching the proceedings with a calm but determined demeanor. He had done his part, and now justice would take its course. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, a wave of relief swept through the room. The townspeople, who had lived in fear for so long, finally felt a sense of closure. Applause erupted as the judge handed down the sentences, ensuring that Roy and his gang would spend many years behind bars. James stood quietly, nodding to himself. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about ensuring that Madison could move forward without the shadow of the bikers looming over it. In the days that followed, the town seemed to transform. The streets felt livelier, the people more confident. Businesses that had once been too afraid to operate freely began to flourish. The sense of fear that had gripped Madison for so long had been replaced with hope and unity. James found himself at the center of it all, not as a hero seeking recognition, but as a symbol of what courage and resilience could achieve. Despite the positivity, James remained grounded. He knew his role wasn't just to inspire, but also to support the community in tangible ways. He began organizing boxing workshops at the local community center, using his skills to teach discipline, self-defense, and confidence to kids and teenagers. The workshops quickly grew in popularity, attracting not only young people, but also adults who wanted to regain their strength and sense of control. For many, it wasn't just about physical fitness. It was about reclaiming their lives. One evening, as James wrapped up a training session, an older man approached him. It was Mr. Tanner, the elderly resident who had thanked him earlier. "James," Tanner said, his voice warm, "I just wanted to say, you've done more for this town than anyone ever could. You didn't just fight for us, you gave us back our courage." James smiled and shook his hand. "You had it all along. You just needed a reason to believe in it." Tanner nodded, his eyes glistening. "And you were that reason." The moment was humbling for James. He had spent much of his life in the spotlight, fighting for titles and fame. But this felt different. This wasn't about personal glory. It was about something bigger than himself. As the weeks turned into months, James's impact continued to grow. The town rallied around him, not just as a protector, but as a leader. Madison began hosting community events, fundraisers, and town hall meetings, with James often at the center. His presence brought people together, fostering a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. The transformation of the town became a testament to what could happen when fear was replaced with determination. One evening, as James walked home after a long day, he paused to look out over the town from a hilltop. The lights of Madison twinkled below, a reflection of the resilience and spirit of its people. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the glories of the boxing ring to the challenges of rebuilding his life in a new place. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had found a purpose beyond the sport that had once defined him. As the cool night breeze brushed against his face, James felt a deep sense of peace. The town had given him a home, and in return, he had given it hope. The battles he had fought, both in and out of the ring, had led him to this moment. And though the future was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Justice was served, and the town will never be the same. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Your support means everything.